So this presentation is all going to be about generative AI web development with Angular. So raise your hand if you're an Angular developer. OK, so like 50% of the room. Raise your hand if you're an Angular user. OK, that's a trick question. It should be everybody. We are at Cloud Next. And if you didn't know, everybody here uses Angular as an end user in some way because all of Google Cloud is written with Angular. So trick question. If you're at an event for Cloud Next, I'm going to assume you're probably using Cloud in some way, and all of that is Angular. And in fact, a ton of Google is built with Angular. Does that work now? OK. What's on the screen is not the... Do you want me to just go through? OK. Just see all my slides in reverse and pretend you're not seeing this. Magic. OK, cool. The speaker notes are still not accurate. OK, cool. Anyways, so I'm going to keep talking. So yeah, all of Google Cloud is built with Angular. And in fact, a ton of Google services are built with Angular. Angular is Google's recommended web framework. But even more than that, all code at Google is written and touches Angular in some way, from the IDE that all Google developers use to build code internally, to how we ship code to you, to a ton of the Google Cloud services and products. We recently announced that even YouTube is using some of Angular's primitives under the hood. So whether it's like work, play, pleasure, fun, all of those things are Angular. And I still don't have my speaker notes. Should I keep going? I'm so sorry. This is the penultimate talk, and this is what is likely to happen. Is there any way we can get my speaker notes up? OK. Well, I'm just going to keep going, and maybe it'll come. So recently, the web framework more as a whole has been talking about something that other people have coined an Angular renaissance. And I know what you're thinking. Obviously, the team I'm on is just really good at writing classical music. And we should all switch our jobs and work on that instead. But actually what it is people have noticed that Angular's velocity has increased a ton recently. Angular has always been seen as this very stable web framework, but it hasn't necessarily always been seen as like cutting edge and forward moving. So its place has always been in this like enterprise developer space, and Google has recognized it in that way, but externally a lot of our customers are more enterprise, people looking for stability. And this renaissance really takes into picture the fact that we have been shipping. What have we been shipping? A ton of different features and code. The team's velocity has increased a ton recently. And that hasn't always been the case, like I said. If you look back to like 2011, the space when web frameworks and web development was really starting to take hold, and we were like moving away from HTML, right? Like the CSS like landscape was beginning. People were starting to have these ideas of web frameworks. It was the time when like if those people woke up today, they would be shocked by this like massive ecosystem of JavaScript frameworks. And since then, our team has slowly been gaining momentum. So Angular first launched in 2011 as AngularJS, the current Angular's predecessor. It took 3 years for us to sort of come up with maybe a new version of Angular and what that might be. And from the launch of Angular 2 until now, each incremental step that you could call like a major change in the web platform has slowly gotten closer together, right? So we rewrote our rendering engine to Ivy in like 2020. In 2022, we launched the start of a new reactivity system. And since then, each year has shortened to like each 6 months, has shortened to each minor release. we've slowly been shipping more and more incremental features to the framework, all with this idea of bringing innovation to the web in a stability-forward way, with enterprises in mind. And one of the greatest things is we are part of the Google ecosystem that isn't doing this alone. So we are part of the web platform as a whole, and we have thousands of open source contributors contributing to Angular in open source to ensure that Angular meets the needs of developers, not just at Google, but the millions of Angular developers across the world. And if you look at those PRs that each person is contributing, and you can look at every single piece of code going into Angular, you'll see this thing called Google internal tests. And that's because everything that goes into Angular also goes into Google Cloud, it goes into YouTube, it goes into everything using Angular at Google. So all of Google's monorepo, called Google 3, is specifically targeting the head of Angular's main branch. So there is no Angular versions at Google. All of Google just uses whatever the newest thing is, even beyond what the newest release is. And that means that when you push a branch and you PR into Angular on GitHub, all of Google's code base is going to use that. We're going to sync that with Google. And that means that that can cause a lot of friction, right? So if you've ever tried to contribute to Angular, something we always hear from open source contributors is that it's really hard. And I could do an entire talk on how we're trying to get open source contributors to bridge this gap of Google. But it also means that this is the sweet spot of why Angular has excelled in the enterprise space. And it's because we have all of Google ensuring that that code being merged into open source is stable and meets the needs and passes the tests of a massive monorepo of code like Google's. And so with that stability of all of Google, we bring that stability into our open source space for all of our customers. And in fact, Google's monorepo isn't the only place. OK, now my slides are just OK, thank you. And so stability isn't the only thing that we look for when we look for new features. And in fact, we are highly data-driven when it comes to how we make decisions with Angular to help you deliver modern apps. So we run surveys, and we ensure that everything we're doing and everything our team is prioritizing comes from the open source, not just our internal customers at Google. And with that, you can sort of put all of the features that our team has been shipping in these last 6 months, year, into the future into 3 buckets. And those are developer experience, performance, and stability and reliability. So we've already touched on stability and reliability, which is just that underlying infrastructure of how we ship code in open source and use Google to maintain stability. But I want to talk about the first 2, and then once we talk about those first 2 and some of the features that Angular has, we'll dig into how this creates the perfect ecosystem to test some of these Gen AI features and move into a Gen AI demo. So if you're looking for the AI, it's at the end. So developer experience, let's talk about it. Developer experience didn't exist as a term when Angular was first launched. It didn't exist as a term on the web when any web framework was first launched. Except in some of these more modern years. But what it means is that you as a developer have a really good time building code, and it's not just the end user that has a beautiful UI experience, but that you actually like writing code. And one of the biggest things Angular has done, if you haven't visited the framework recently, is remove a ton of sort of starting concepts. So one of them was, if you've ever written an Angular component, you might be used to this, and we had this idea of ng modules, which aren't JavaScript modules. They're an entirely separate concept. And that's all I'm going to talk about them, because they are optional and don't really exist anymore. And so that long code becomes as short as this, right? So essentially, along with migration scripts and backwards compatibility, we've led Angular to a place where we've removed an entire concept from how developers get started. And we've seen a ton of feedback that this simplifies the mental model of how developers learn Angular and made it easier for teams to onboard new people. Now, I mentioned there that there are migration scripts. That's part of that stability. So along with syncing all of our code with Google 3, we've also ensured that we have to bring Google 3 code along with us. So as part of something like the standalone migration, we wrote a ton of migration scripts to make sure that Google code updated to standalone with us. And then we open sourced it and put that in our command line interface, or CLI, so that, again, you can get from this long code to this short code by running a single command line piece of code, and that we know it works really well against all of the edge cases of all of the great and not so great ways people write code internal to Google, and we could test those scripts really well. Another thing that we've been doing is exploring change detection. So currently on the web, you may know that when you want to make a change to something on your DOM, we microtask the queue, and we say, if you have a change, we need to look at the entire tree of dependency to see what might have updated in your UI. In our improved change detection model, we've said, what if we can pinpoint that change more incrementally and know within your data model what pieces of the UI need to be updated? And so we've taken a more fine-grained approach to our reactivity model. And this is something that we landed on called Angular Signals, which are available in v17 and part of a developer preview we have right now. Now, signals aren't new to the web. We collaborated with a lot of other frameworks that have come to this to bring it to something as large as the Google scale. And Angular Signals is a system that granularly tracks how and where your state is used throughout an application, which allows the framework to optimize rendering updates. So here, I set a signal like my title, and a signal is wrapped around a value that notifies interested consumers when that specific value changes. But signals can contain any value from primitives to complex data structures. Then I read that signal's value by calling its getter function, which allows Angular to track where the signal is used. And I set the signal's value similar to how you might set any sort of value. You can either set it directly or only the affected parts within your template, and that will schedule the update so that only that incremental piece of your UI is being changed. We are slowly in the process of introducing these primitives to the web, and we've seen a ton of really great performance results. But that's not it, right? So each incremental change, we're trying to get closer to a more reactive-based system. So in the minors following that first primitive release, we've also added some new additional features to Angular, such as signal inputs. Signal inputs allow values to be bound from parent components, and those values are exposed using a signal and can change during the life cycle of a component. As well, we launched in the same minor model inputs, which act as sort of like a model value. So model gives you a writable signal that you can update values directly, and they will propagate values back through a two-way binding. So this brings Angular's super popular two-way binding model to signals and crosses those two reactivity models. Finally, when we say queries, we're usually thinking about the APIs like view child and content children, and those can be really verbose. So signal queries landed again in v17.2, I think actually. And this allows you to create a signal of the query result. So similar to how you might query part of your template and get a view child and do something with that, you can now query it using a signal, get a signal in response, and again, be a little bit more opinionated about the reactivity of when you're doing updates on your model. It's overall more concise, more consistent, and takes better advantage of type inference. And all of these things we did through RFC. So again, in that open source space, we publish a lot of our design documentation specifically to GitHub, and we get open source feedback on that. Another thing we brought to RFC in the last year is control flow. And this led to a ton of discussion and ultimately changed the actual design of control flow. Now, what control flow is a significantly more intuitive way to write Angular templates that's a lot closer to JavaScript. So again, if you haven't visited Angular in a while, this may look like super wild, but this is now totally valid in an Angular component or an Angular template. And it follows the JavaScript model of like if, else blocks, and brings along the ability to do a bunch of really cool stuff with performance. And best of all, again, you can automatically refactor your code to this new syntax with Angular CLI and migration scripts that we have tested. And all of these things, but specifically that control flow, has given us the opportunity as a team to improve our list diffing algorithms so that for loops use a different algorithm under the hood, essentially. And this has improved the Angular performance out of the box by quite a bit, with up to 90% improvements in some of the sort of like baseline JavaScript benchmark tests. So if you go to this link, you can see, but if you look at how we're doing in comparison to other frameworks, that performance of Angular has really moved to the green space and the left of this graph significantly with some of these improvements. And this is all out of the box of what you're getting with just updating to the latest versions of Angular and using the migration scripts to get some of these new built-in enhancements. These new enhancements also have a lot of like tricks to them, right? So within the Angular compiler, we have a lot of tools such as extended diagnostics that you can use in your VS Code or wherever you're writing code to make sure that you're using these new tools and features out of the box. And in addition to in your IDE, you can also go inside of your actual browser and download Angular dev tools and see things like dependency injection, an injection tree, and all of the things that you might need to be able to debug these new features directly in your browser with Angular dev tools. So that's developer experience. But obviously, we touched a little bit on performance, since those are strongly tied together. Let's talk a little bit more about what we're doing with performance. So we're also shipping here. Specifically, we launched the Angular image directive. This is a built-in image directive to Angular. All you need to do is change the source of your image to ng source, and you get a ton of improvement under the hood. Specifically, we've seen customers reach about 75% improvement with LCP in your Core Web Vitals. And this is all, again, under the hood, just updating your ng source and looking at the documentation of the Angular image directive. This was done in collaboration directly with Chrome's Aurora team, which works on Core Web Vitals. And again, all of this is built into this idea of Angular giving you performance and best practices out of the box. In addition, we have looked at declarative loading and prefetching. So last year, we opened that RFC about declarative loading. This used that control flow out of the box, and it's now available in developer preview. So it allows you to extract parts of your template and load them on demand. And all of these amazing features are available now either in developer preview or ready for production. Using those deferrable views with control flow, one customer, Bill.com, saw a 50% reduction in their bundle size using deferrable views. So again, purely out of the box, a lot of performance gains there. And all of this is represented by a rebrand that we've launched on angular.dev. So if you're looking for all of the documentation of all of these new features, head to angular.dev for new documentation, but also new embedded tutorials that allow you to jump into code. So if you were an Angular developer and you left it, and now 6 years later you want to come back to it, we have incremental tutorials for you to learn just one of the features I've mentioned, like signal inputs or writing a defer block. To jump in, do this all directly in the browser, and incrementally learn some of the new features of Angular, especially if you're ng updating and you're getting these automatic things out of the box and you need to know how to take advantage of them. This has been the way that I have been learning Angular. And if you're interested in what's coming up, you can learn about all of this and more on our new documentations roadmap, which talks about all of the things I've talked about today, but in significantly more depth, as well as a lot of the things we're thinking about for the future. Some of those things include partial hydration. So I mentioned that we've already looked at and released something for non-destructive hydration. But some frameworks out there are doing more, and we want to be a part of that. So we're looking at how fine-grained code loading could be a part of the Angular story. We're also looking at more fine-grained reactivity, right? So I mentioned that we've integrated signals and that those primitives are being used across Google, not just in Angular applications, but across frameworks. We really believe that signals is offering the best practices for helping your developers write more performant applications, but we know that we can be more fine-grained, right? And so we are working on a fully zoneless option. We're also working on hot module replacement, streaming SSR, component authoring, a ton of different things. Again, head to our roadmap to learn more. Now, the other word in the title of this talk was generative AI. So obviously, we need to talk about it. And so our team specifically collaborated with the Gemini team to make sure that there's really great tutorials on how to get started if you go to this URL. And for those who haven't dipped your toes in already, we're going to talk about just how easy it is to get developing with Gemini and the AI SDKs that Google offers. So it's really this easy. You install the package just like you'd install anything else in your package.json, Google/generative-AI. It's going to add a single package. That's it. And then you'll initialize the generative model. So in this case, I literally went into like my base component, and I created an API key. Obviously, here I'm just calling it API key, but you would need to go to Google and get one of those yourself. I'm not going to give you mine. And then once you initialize that generative model, we're going to create this generative model, and we're going to say which model we want to use. Here I'm using Gemini Pro, but you can go to their documentation and use any level of models. I'm sure there's a new one by the end of this talk already. And obviously, if this is a public app, you would want to move that API key into an environment variable. I'm just trying to keep this all in a single file for you so that it's super easy. And then you can do with that model what you want. So Gemini obviously does multi-mode conversations. It does text. It does images. It does all kinds of stuff. But it's really as easy as using that model object and calling generate content. I believe it's generate image if you want to generate an image, things like that. And you hand it some value. And Gemini will give you its knowledge back on what that is. This can all happen in the browser, so that literally you could deploy this code, and that'd be it. And yeah, it's really that easy. So like, talk over, right? No. I did that research, and I helped that team with the deck on how to get started. And I was like, wow, I gave you 3 slides. Like, that was too easy, which is good, because I think we all are going to walk away from Cloud Next and say, like, we want to dip our toes in and figure out what really is Gemini. Like, what can I do with this model? What can it give me? I've learned about all of these different techniques of things I can add on top of it to make my model more specific, to specify it. But how do we as developers actually start using these things? And I think the best way is to build something bigger. So the question I asked myself is, what if I could ask the docs that I helped to develop and launch with our team a question, right? We have tons of really intelligent developers writing documentation for us. And I would love to just sit with them and like pair program all day, but they're busy and don't want to always answer my questions within 30 seconds. But I know a tool that can. And so how could I use Angular.dev and the wealth of Angular-specific knowledge that it has to be able to ask Angular-specific questions to a model like Gemini and get really intelligent responses? And even more broadly, I went looking at what other teams are doing with chatbots. And I found out that about like 60, 70% of experimentation with large LLMs right now is chatbots. And it's because it's such an obvious place to get started, right? Like, we have these conversational models that want to give us answers, so we want to ask them questions. So I think a chatbot is a great place to start. And as a quick note, where should we host this? We're going to use the experimental support for Angular's hosting of Firebase because we work closely with that team, and it provided a really great place to experiment and create emulators that would allow me to do these things. So what are we going to use? All of these terms. So I'm going to switch over to a demo and live code, because that can't go wrong. Nothing else has gone wrong today, obviously. Yeah. So I'm going to present this, and we're going to switch over, if possible. Can you see my code? Awesome. Yeah. So like I said, I gave you a whirlwind of like Angular's latest features. And so I want to use as many of those as possible to show just how good it is to demo something like really quickly and get you using Gemini's APIs as quickly as possible. So we're going to implement all of these things. And most of them are already implemented in this demo for time's sake, so I'm going to just sort of do like a code review and walkthrough. But we're just going to go down the list. So we're going to start with Angular deferrable views. So this is my code base to start. I'm going to do my best to not open anything that has any sort of API key. And if I do, everyone's going to close your eyes, and it's not going to exist. So if we look at what this code is to start, we have a very important website. Imagine that this is angular.dev, or that this is your enterprise website, or some like fun website you have already. And we know it has a bunch of really great information, and we want to pull that information and create a chatbot. So I have a little chat widget. We're all UI developers, and I can ask it questions. I have some pre-seeded questions, or I can say like, hello. And what it's going to do is give an answer back. And what this is doing under the hood is, if I actually look at that method, it said hello back in oddly large fonts. And what that's doing is it's actually calling a method I have called fetchAnswer. I just moved this into a service to do this a little bit more in the Angular way. And what that object is doing is literally what I said earlier. I'm calling generate content on a Gen AI model that I've created using Gemini, targeting Gemini Pro. And Gemini Pro within the browser is giving me back an answer to whatever that question is. So if I go back to that demo, and you look at my source code, let's see. If I console log it, you can see that literally, I'm going to open this, and I'm going to say, like, what are Angular signals? And in the browser, Gemini is giving me an answer in like odd markdown HTML. I could work on formatting. And it actually did a pretty good job, right? Like, this is baseline Gemini. Just what does Gemini know about Angular? It seems to know some stuff. And it does a pretty good job. If I ask what is control flow, I'm going to assume it's going to do a pretty bad job. And the reason is I didn't say Angular, but I'm on an Angular website, so like it should probably know. It's going to give me like a really broad thing about like sequential execution, looping, jumping. This is not Angular. Like this, if I was an Angular developer and I asked this question, I'd be very confused. This is control flow at large, because this is Gemini at large, and it doesn't really have any specific knowledge. So before I jump into that, we have this UI widget. So I want to point out that most of the time, like, people come to your website, they're not going to click the chat widget, right? Like, maybe 2% of people are going to be interested in this thing. But we're loading it in the main bundle, right? So this is part of my initial load and bundle size. And that's not great. So before I do a ton of work and add a bunch of extra computation and increase the bundle size of this component, I want to move it out of the main bundle. So I'm going to do that using Angular deferrable views. And it's really quite simple. All I'm going to do is go to that chat component, and I have my app chat. So within my details, I'm toggling and opening this app chat. If I look at my network tab, I can actually see that if I load this page in the main bundle, I'm loading the chat component. And that's part of my main bundle size. Let me see, chat component. Yeah, so my chat component is part of that main bundle size. It's not great. It's fine. It's not great. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the defer block. Oops. And I'm going to defer so that when this component comes into the viewport, I load my chat component. Otherwise, I'm just going to have a loading placeholder. So instead of including this entire component in my main bundle, I'm just going to defer it so that only if it comes into view. So for the 90% of people who aren't interested in the rest of this demo and never open my chat component, we're going to move it out of that. And I'm going to save that, again, on viewport. I didn't import anything extra. This is all within Angular's core packages. I got this defer block out of the box. And look at that nice syntax highlighting. Ooh. And now if I reload my page, I'm going to see that if I go to my main bundle in my network tab and I search for a chat component, it's no longer being loaded. It's now missing. And that makes a lot of sense because it's not loaded on the page. And so if I scroll down and I open my chatbot, now I can see that in this chunk that loaded after the fact, my chat component is being lazily loaded after the fact. So it's in this chunk that only is being loaded if I open that part of my UI. So check mark on deferrable views. We've already decreased the bundle size significantly and deferred that loading, which is quite cool. And again, incredibly little code to do that. My next thing is Firebase Cloud Functions. So in order to do the rest of this coding demo, I'm going to use some more complicated systems, specifically retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, if you've been hearing it around. And in order to do that, I need to use some SDKs that are a little beyond the Gemini API's knowledge in the browser. And I want to write those functions in Python, because that's where all of AI seems to be writing their code these days. And those are first-class supported. And because I'm going to use something experimental, I'm going to use it with the Python SDK. And the best way to do that is with a Firebase Cloud Function. So just as a note, you'll see that I'm running all of this on a Firebase emulator. I'm doing all of this with experimental Firebase support. And dare I stop my application? I don't know if that was a good idea. All of this is being run with Firebase emulators so that I can have some cloud functions running that are going to run some Python code for me. Please restart. Please. Yes. Yeah, so if you'll see, I'm using an early preview of Angular support on Firebase hosting, and I'm running some cloud functions that are going to allow me to do some of the more complex stuff. So that's a little bit cheating of a demo, but check mark, Firebase Cloud Functions. So next, and I guess check mark, early preview of Angular support in Firebase hosting, which is a mouthful. Next, I'm already using the Generative Languages API. That's just the API that I'm using to call Gemini already. But I want to move to something smarter. So like I said, in my actual code, if I look at my demo, again, it was really good at answering what are Angular signals because I was pretty specific. It was really bad at answering what is control flow. So I want to do something that's a little bit more intelligent, and I want to semantically retrieve code based on a model that I've already preloaded that has knowledge of Angular's code base. So this is a model called RAG. And essentially what this is instead of just going to Gemini and asking a question, I go to Gemini and I ask that question. And then I go to my semantic corpus of documentation, and I say, was Gemini really right? And so with that knowledge and with that special corpus, my Gemini answer can kind of be like fact-checked with a specific set of documentation. So in this case, I would say, what is control flow? Gemini would give a like very incorrect answer. Then I'd go to my semantic retrieval API, check it, and it would say, actually, I have specific and special knowledge of the angular.dev code base, and I can tell you that control flow is mentioned in these specific pages of the documentation, and it's defined in this special Angular way. And this works specifically well for code bases and code chatbots where there are things that we talk about, like modules, that we as developers know, but if you've ever had a conversation with another developer in front of like a friend or like a partner or somebody in your life, a kid who has no idea about the like code language you're talking about, it sounds like you're speaking like alien, right? And so this sort of helps us get out of that like alien speak level. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to, let's see, we're done with this one. I'm going to go to my chat component, and instead of getting my answer from my general model, I'm going to call my Firebase function with generative language and get my attributed question answer. So let's dig into what that is. So I'm sending the same thing. I'm sending my prompt. I'm asking the same question, but to a slightly more intelligent corpus. It's the same model. I want to be very clear. We're not custom training any models here. We're just asking a question to a slightly more intelligent grouping of documentation. And that's really important, especially for Angular, because I've emphasized a lot that Angular is open source. We care a lot about that. But it also means that we don't want to custom train models on code that we don't own. And when people contribute code to Angular, we don't want to in any way inhibit them from being interested in doing that by using their code in some sort of way, right? Even though it's in the open source, people sign a CLA and they agree that Google will be deploying their code within Angular, but they don't agree to be a part of training. So we want to respect that, and we want to make sure that we're not misusing other people's code. So instead, we're using this semantic retrieval API. And within that, I'm going to call a method in my Firebase function. So let's look at that. So what I'm doing here is I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm authenticating in to my object. I'm creating a generative services client, which is the same thing as that model. And I'm just giving it the text in a slightly more Python-y way and getting an answer from it. The specific thing here is that I'm also giving it a corpus that I've pre-populated on the back end, and we can look at the semantic retrieval API documentation. But essentially, if you look at here, all you're doing is you're asking Gemini a question and giving it knowledge to a specific corpus. And so if I save my code, we can see the result of that. And the result is pretty cool. So I'm going to ask the same question, what is control flow? And I'm going to wait for it to do some answers. And I'm going to see if it's any smarter now that it has knowledge. And it is. It's significantly smarter, right? So that semantic retrieval API with RAG is now specifically aware that it's on angular.dev. It has access to that corpus. And I haven't done any work to help it understand any of the language there. So I could really dive in and make this a lot better if I had an extra week to work on this demo. But what it's doing here is it's specifically saying control flow is a way to show, hide, and repeat elements in Angular templates. That sounds really right to me. And here are the different control flow elements you can use. Here are the operations. And hey, do you want to learn more about this? Here's the page of the documentation that I got this information from, which I think is really cool. I'm also doing something even better, which is I'm saying, don't just give me an answer, but give me follow-up questions. Like if I ask this question, what should I ask next? And here I say, let's ask, how do I use Angular control flow blocks? So not only what are they, but how do I use them? And let's see if it comes up with some code. And so now, if the documentation has a good answer, it's going to give me a really great answer in this chatbot because it has knowledge of those documentation. And so I've actually taken this to my team and said, hey, if the model doesn't have an answer, it's not that the model's bad. It might be that our documentation is bad, which is really cool. And again, here it came up with a lot of the same, but it specifically came up with extended diagnostics of how to debug your control flow box. Does somebody have a question specific to Angular? Shout it out. I'll do what is new. Just what is new. Let's see if it knows. And while it does that, let's look at our checklist. Awesome. So Angular has some new features, again, specific to Angular. But it's looking at things that we've called out as new in the documentation. We could be even smarter about this and give it knowledge of when the code was most recently updated, so it could look at what pieces of the documentation code were recently PR'd into. But here, it's calling out that these are all things that were in the latest release. So the new application builder, track in NG4, and again, that control flow. And it has some follow-ups that really try and point you towards talking about how to use things and what are the benefits of them, which is quite cool. So if I look at my checkbox, I'm using deferrable views for performance and removing all of this work from the main bundle. I'm doing all of this in Cloud Functions. I'm using those APIs and early Firebase support. And I'm getting an attributed answer to all of my responses with the semantic retrieval API. And so I just want to call out that all of this is being done with control flow. So instead of repeating all of those classes here, I can use a control flow for and go through my follow-up questions and show them. Nothing's going to change on the UI. But boy, was that easier to write than copying and pasting the same button element. What else? And if I look in my chat component, I'm doing all of these with signals, and I'm specifically using a view child query that's required to get a signal of the conversation I've had so far, and then use that object to update the signal value of my conversation each time I get a new response. That means that only the part of the DOM that's being updated is that part within that chat component. My reactivity model is more specifically just checking within my chat component, not the entire application outside of it. So whatever my very important app is protected, and all of this is done in a very performant way. And this has allowed me to experiment with a chatbot, with some of these new APIs, with Gemini, all in Angular, using this very performant best practices out of the box model. So to summarize, Angular is continuing to help deliver web apps with confidence. And we're doing that by prioritizing developer experience with all of these features and more. We're focused on performance with all of these features and more. And we're doing all of this while ensuring that we bring the same backwards compatibility, stability, reliability, and migrations that we've always had, just in a more iterative and innovative way.